Hello again, welcome back. Here we are to continue talking about JavaScript, learning about web APIs, and creating a library of code that works with a web API. In the previous couple videos, we talked about the background, um, you know, information and using callbacks and promise to handle asynchronous actions, right? In this video, what I'd like to do is get started on the project itself and start talking through a solution to the project, okay? And get you started on solving the problem here. So this is a link to the Weather API starter code that I'm going to give you. I'll put a link in the description to the video. And what you'll do is you'll go here, you'll go to the code button and click on download zip. You can also clone the project if you like. So that should download the project into my folder here and my downloads folder, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the downloads folder, and I think I'm just going to move this to the desktop. And then I'll open up this folder as a project in VS Code. So now I have it in my VS Code window here, and I'm just going to arrange the windows because I'll want to look at the project in the browser. So I'm going to see the project over here, and then I'll edit the project over on this side. Okay, great. So the project itself just has a couple files. Really, all the code for the project is contained in index.html. So if we look at that, we'll have a standard HTML file, and then there's a style tag at the top with the style sheet. And then below that, there's some HTML here, right? That is, it's a form, and there's an H1 and a P tag, right? Let's actually open the file up and see what it looks like. I'm going to use live server, and you'll need to use this for this project. So you'll need a localhost server. You can use live server. Brackets has a built-in localhost server. You can't run it directly in the browser, right? So you shouldn't be opening this from the desktop. Okay, so I've got a live server installed. If you go to, if you're in VS Code, this also works. They have an extension for Atom and other code editors too. So if you go to, preferences, where is it here? Oh, extensions, right? And then type, live server, right? Then you'll see live server here, and there's live server by Ritwick, and you can download it. I have already installed it though, so I don't need to do that. Okay, great. So once you got live server installed, you can click on index.html and then click, you should see a go live button down at the bottom here. They also have a menu up here somewhere too, so you can start it there if you want. I think you can also right click. There's a few ways to do that. You can say open with live server by right clicking. So any of those should work. So when we open the page, what we see over here is going to look like this in the browser. Okay, so what you're seeing here is an input element and a search button. Okay, and then above this, there's two empty elements that you can't see because they don't have any text in them, but those are the H1 and the paragraph tag here. So there's an H1 here and a paragraph. And then below that, there's a form, and the form has an input and a button. So here is the input on the left side and the button that says search on the right side. And if you type in a zip code, like I type in 94010, and then I click search, it'll give me the temperature. Or maybe you type in 90210, right? Beverly Hills, right? So 65, wow, it's great temperature over there. Clear skies, great day in Beverly Hills, right? So this is what the app does. It goes out on the internet, it pulls in the weather data from the Open Weather Map API, right? So, well, it all works. What are you going to do? Well, let's talk about the code here for a moment. So the code in this app was kind of written in a naive way, okay? So all of the code is written in the same document here. And while it works, it's not great. It's not best practice, right? So what we want to do is we want to look at the code here and pull out the code that does the job of fetching the weather data from the interwebs, right? The Open Weather Map API, and then also separate the code and pull the code aside that actually does the job of displaying the weather in the web page, right? Because those are two different actions. So we need one block of code that goes out on the internet, pulls in the weather data, and hands the data to the other block of code that has the job of displaying it here in the browser, right? And why we want to do this is because if we do that, then we can use the code that fetches the weather data in any application that might need the weather data, right? Instead of having to rewrite all that code and have it intermingled with other code that isn't useful in other places, we can just make a block of code whose job it is to go get the weather data, right? And then that's useful anywhere. Displaying the weather, in this web page, the way that it's displayed is just specific to this web page, right? Because we might have another web page that needs to display the data, different data, display the data in different places and, different HTML elements in a different way, right? Okay, so what do we have here? Let's take a look at it. So at the top here, I have this H1 element that has an ID name of temp. And then I have another H1, or a paragraph tag actually, that has an ID name of description. And then there's a form with an ID of form and an input with the ID of zip. Okay, so those four elements there are right here. So this code is the code that generates a reference to the HTML elements above here. So if I want to control those elements, like pull out the zip code that you typed into this input and display the temperature data within this H1, I need a reference to this HTML element to do that, right? So I'm going to use this code here to get those references, and I'm going to store the reference in a variable for later use. So the code runs, it grabs the temp element by its ID name, the description, the form, and the zip, right? It stores those for later. And then it sets up a listener for a submit event. So when you submit the form by clicking the button, then it's going to run the code here, right? So the code here grabs the zip from the zip input, right? That's this guy, pulls the zip code that you typed in out, and then it calls this get weather function and passes the zip in. Okay, so that's the get weather function is the rest of the code that we have here. And this, I'm going to have to format that a little better, right? So the get weather function has the job of getting the weather data. So this code right here could be useful in a lot of other apps. Okay, so this could be useful in many places. We could share this with the world. Anybody else making weather apps, they could use this code. The problem here is one, it has my API key embedded in it. Two, it references some HTML elements that maybe the rest of the world is not using, right? And it only gets the temperature and the description, right? Some people might want to get the wind direction or an image for the particular weather situation. They might want to get the there's like a temperature, like a min max for the day. There's also a feels like, so it could say temperature is 55, feels like 42 because it's really windy or something, right? So they might want to display more information than we have. So this is not useful, right? So what we want to do is we want to pull this out, and first job is put it in a place where anybody could use it, right? Because if it's sitting in here, the only way someone could use it would be to copy and paste this block of code into another file and then edit the block of code, right? So we don't want to do that. Instead, we want to just give them a functioning block of code that they can use, by just calling the method getWeather, right? So they'll be able to call this, supply some parameters to the function, and then receive weather data back from this function. Okay, so what is our first step here? Let me format my code a little better. Okay, so the first step, so getting started is download the code, open it up in the browser, take a look at it, type in a couple zip codes. Is that a zip code? Oh yeah, it must be 29 degrees. Wow, I think that's on the East Coast somewhere, right? Pretty cold. So our first step is to move this code into another document, right? So that makes it portable, right? If it's in a separate document, someone can just copy that document into their file, right? Or into their project, right? They don't have to actually copy and paste the code itself, right? So let's do that. So I'm going to make a brand new file here, and I'll call it, let's call it, actually, you know what I think I'll do is I'll put it in a source directory. Let's do this. Let's make a folder here and call it src. And then I'm going to save this file to the source directory, and I'll call it index.js. Okay? So now I've got my index file, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my file here, my index.html, and cut the getWeather function out of there. Okay? And what I'll do is I'll paste it into this file. Okay, so that's our first step. And we're going to use a system called module, right? So we're going to use the module system to import and export code from one file to another. There's a couple ways to do this. This is the newer, kind of more modern way to do it, and I think it works really good. It's the future, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to export this function to make it available somewhere else. So at the bottom here, I'm going to add an export statement. And you can export this in a couple ways. I'm going to export getWeather. So I'll export this function right here at the bottom. So I'll put the curly brackets around it and then say export. And in the index.html file, I'm going to go to the script tag. And in order for this script tag to be able to import code from somewhere else, it has to have type equals module here. So I'll put type is module, right? And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to, at the top of the tag here, we're going to say import curly brackets getWeather from, and then quotation marks, and then we'll name the file. So I'm going to do ./source/index.js, right? So what I've done here is I've said, let's import this thing that was exported from this file, and then I included a path to that file. So notice I put the curly brackets around this, and it looks the same as the export situation that we had over here, right? Like, so I said export, and I put that in the curly braces, right? Okay, so let's give it a try now. So if I run my code here, if I save everything, it should update in the server here, and I should be able to type in 90210. Oh man, I got an error. What do we do when we get an error? Let's go to the inspector and see if I misspelled something. Oh, it says can't find variable temp element. Okay, so that's okay, right? I've created a module, and in my module, any variables that I have here are not available unless I send them in somehow, right? Okay, so how are we going to fix that, right? What we need to do is extract this block of code here from this file, because these variables are declared in our index.html file, right? So these are declared here, and we need to keep those in here, but the code in here is just going to generate the weather data, right? It's going to pull the weather data in, okay? So let's do that. So I'm looking at the getWeather function, and I need to take these two things out of here because these names, get temp element and description element, don't exist here. They exist in this file, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to pull these guys out. I'm going to cut them. And then what I need to do is I need to do something with them here. Let's put them here like this for now and comment them, right? And this function right here, it needs a way to return the weather data to us. And the problem here is it's an asynchronous function, so it actually has to do some work. I can't just say return the weather data, right? I can't say return JSON here, okay? What we need to do is we need to be able to send that somehow back after fetch has run, okay? So if we return, it'll happen immediately when you call the function, but fetch, when it loads the data, that's going to happen sometime later or sometime in the future, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to use a callback, right? So in the previous videos, we talked about callbacks. Let's use the callback here. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give getWeather a callback, and we can do that. We can pass it in as a parameter. So I'm going to go to getWeather function, I see that it takes zip as a parameter. And I'm going to put a comma here, and I'll say weather. Actually, let's call it success callback, right? So I've got a value here, and let's imagine that this value is a function, okay? So that means that here, if I was to call the success callback, I would put the parentheses on the end of it, and that would execute success callback as a function. And, you know, like all functions, we can pass a value into that function, so I can take the JSON data and pass it in here, okay? So now we have to just make sure that success callback gets a value and that that value is a function. So let's try that. I'm going to go to index HTML here. Let me make my window a little bit wider and show our code side by side, right? So here we are in get weather function on the left side, and here we're calling the get weather function on the right side. So we've imported get weather from index over here, and on this side we're executing or invoking the function, right? And we can see the function takes in a zip code and a success callback. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a comma here and provide a callback function. And in the previous videos, we saw that we used a callback function. We wrote it oftentimes as an arrow function. You can actually write any kind of regular function or arrow function here if you like, but I'm going to write this function here like this as an arrow function. Okay, so first parameter is the zip code, comma, second parameter is an arrow function, right? And functions in JavaScript are values, so you can assign them in the same way that you assign a value to a string or a number, right? To a variable, right? So here, when we call this success callback is going to be this arrow function. Now, if we look at the code here, you can see we're calling success callback and we're passing it a parameter called JSON. So actually, this JSON parameter right here, we can receive it by putting a variable here. We could have used the name JSON here if we wanted, and that would be fine. Or we can put any name we want here because this variable is a parameter variable and it just receives the value that you pass in to the function when you invoke it. Okay, so you can put any name here. I'm going to put data there just so we see that they're different, but this data is going to be the data that we loaded as JSON from our get weather function, okay? And then next, we can have this function execute some code, right? So, it's a function that it has code in it that we can use. I'm going to grab these two lines of code that we took out from before and put them inside the function here, okay? And then I'll get rid of the comments there, and there we go, right? So here, if you run the code, it's going to set up an event listener for the form. When you submit the form is going to call this function, which is a callback, right? So it starts here and it ends down here. It's going to, prevent the default behavior. It's going to get the zip code from the input, and then it's going to call the get weather function. It'll supply two parameters, two arguments really, right? This is the value, it's the zip code, and then another value that is a function. So, from here, we go into the get weather function. We get the zip code that was passed in, and success callback is this whole block of code right here. So from the beginning of the function to the end of the function. And then it uses the API key in the units to generate a path. It calls fetch. This is asynchronous, so it waits for fetch to resolve, right? When it gets a response, it streams the response as JSON, and then it's going to receive the JSON data. And here, after it receives the JSON data, it's going to execute the code that we have selected here because that's stored in success callback, and it's going to pass the JSON data into that block of code, and that JSON data will come out here as data, this parameter, okay? So this is looking pretty good, but I used the name JSON here, and this says data. So if I'm going to use the data, I got to change this to data like that, okay? So let's give it a try and see what happens, right? So I'm going to go back to my browser window here and type in a new 90210. Oh, there we go, still 65 degrees, right? So it's great weather there. Let's see, where is another zip code? Let's type in 70342. That was a guess. I don't even know where that is, right? So anyway, so there you go. So that got us started. And there's a few more things we can do once we get this started. Like, there's a whole bunch of things we can do to improve this, right? So here's a challenge for you, right? So now that we've written the code here, I have a problem. I need you to go get your own OpenWeatherMap API key, okay? And we don't want to include the OpenWeatherMap API key in the code here. The OpenWeatherMap API key needs to live in here, and you need to pass it into this function as a parameter. So we need to add another parameter here that is the API key. And then you're going to remove the API key from here. Okay? So try and get that working, right? And then second challenge there is that the unit could also be a parameter to get weather. Okay, so we could have a fourth parameter that could be a unit. Okay, and then there's a couple more challenges. You can read them in the README. Okay, and then we'll continue and solve the challenges in the next video. Okay, thanks for watching.